Welcome to the Progression Health Podcast. I'm here with health psychologist Sula Windgassen. Sula, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, hi. I'm health psychologist, CBT therapist, EMDR therapist, and mindfulness teacher. My area of expertise is working with people with chronic health conditions, using psychology and psychological approaches to improve physical and mental well-being outcomes.
Very good. So you're pretty comprehensive. You've got a lot of areas of mental health covered in your experience. And just to remind people, this is part of a mental health and mindfulness series. So I'll be having a few other experts on, and Sula is the first one. So a health psychologist, that's kind of a newer term in the field of psychology. Can you explain a little bit about the work you do, how you became qualified, and then the type of clients you would work with?
Yeah, absolutely. So health psychology is quite broad. So very broadly speaking, it's the use of psychology applied to health. So whether that's to preventatively address things like physical activity, reducing smoking, to prevent against long-term health conditions, or whether it's to help people who are now already experiencing physical health conditions. There's lots of different ways that psychology can be used to improve health. On one scale, preventative; on one scale, kind of tertiary and meeting an existing need. My area is more on that side, so kind of clinically focused, working with people who are experiencing persistent physical symptoms, long-term health conditions, and utilizing different evidence-based psychological approaches in order to reduce the impact that the illness has on their life, but also in a lot of cases use particular skills, techniques, understanding in order to improve their physical symptom severity as well, using a lot of the neuroscience research on pain and kind of psychoneuroimmunology research on the impact of stress on health, and lots more.
Very good. Yeah. So a kind of a common thing that I see is that people are a little bit kind of nervous or anxious on the gym floor, to go and train on their own or exercise on their own. Could be outside a gym setting. We'll just say to be active. So let's say somebody's listening, and they struggle with this challenge. What would you recommend, or what would you be able to help them with if they, let's just say they had they're generally anxious, or they're just anxious when it comes to activity and exercise? Is there any kind of strategies you would use for a client like that?
Yeah, I guess before I go into the strategies, I'd be interested to know what's behind the anxiety. So it tends to be a symptom rather than, just something that happens. What are the feared predictions and outcomes? And a lot of the time with things like this, it might be around evaluation from others, fear of judgment, or, self-efficacy. Do people think that they're going to be able to do what they're setting out to do? And what's the worry if they're not able to do, if they would go to the gym and only be able to press, 5 kilograms as opposed to what other people are pressing, what's the implication for them? And like I say, a lot of the time there might be focus on what other people are going to think and that fear of judgment. And then that might not be the end, though. There might be more fears around what that judgment means as well. Does that mean something bad about me? Does that mean, I'm a weakling, or, I'm a failure, or whatever it might be. But it might also, mean something regardless of judgment about how they see themselves. So there can be a lot of self-esteem issues around aesthetics as well, whether they're, a particular size and they fear that everybody else is going to be much slimmer, or, they have all these kind of preoccupations with what that means about them being lesser in some way. And as humans, generally, we don't like to see ourselves as lesser. It's an uncomfortable position to be in. So to then put ourselves in a position where we might be confronted with that possibility is really anxiety inducing. So I guess the first step would be to understand what specifically are your fears, and then to kind of unpack that a little bit more.
Yeah, you're reminding me of a previous episode I had with Jamie Tarter, and she's a researcher. So she was looking at anxiety, and I think it was cortisol. Sorry, it was cortisol. So basically, she had participants in the lab, and I think it was social evaluation was the number one thing that got people's cortisol and stress up the most.
Right.
Yeah. Is that something that you would see with clients? And if not, what are kind of other things that you would help people with?
Yeah, I mean, for me, generally, I mean, social evaluation comes in a lot across all different sorts of presentations. In people with chronic illness, there's all sorts of concerns about what other people might be thinking about them. I'm a burden, or I'm lazy, I'm not pulling my weight, or I'm making it up. So all of these things can feel really isolating. A big client group that I work with are people with irritable bowel syndrome. So my PhD was looking at cognitive behavioral therapy for people with IBS and how effective that was. And as you might imagine, a common concern coming up around social evaluation there is, what are people going to think about my symptoms? If I were to pass gas, if I were to keep needing to go to the toilet, and what are people going to think? And that is often entrenched with this sense of embarrassment and shame around toileting, where there is like a social taboo. But often what we're exploring is, to what degree is that taboo applied to other people versus ourselves? So we might feel more shame about our toileting than other people would kind of show judgment towards being confronted by the fact that we need to go to the toilet. So yeah, working with fear of social evaluation in all different ways across different presentations. And part of it is exploring what the beliefs are around that. What do you think that people are going to think? And examining how true that's likely to be. Part of it is testing things out. So putting people in situations that they maybe avoid in a way that they're able to put themselves into. So not maybe jumping in the deep end, but building up to things. And getting that live data back. And that often is a really great way of shifting anxiety. And that can be in the form of exposure. So you just see, can I tolerate this anxiety? Does it go down? And then does that change my belief? Or it can be in the form of like a behavioral experiment. If I go to the toilet twice whilst I'm at a restaurant, does anybody actually notice, for example?
Very good. Yeah. So like jumping back to the example of somebody who's anxious around exercise, or they're a bit intimidated by it. Like how would they sort of start that process of exercising as they would like, and not kind of letting their fears hold them back? What would you, so we'll say they're like, I'm just not going to the gym, I'm not going to the pool, I'm not going to the tennis court, for example. I can't handle that stress. What would be the kind of the starting point, or the smallest step they could take?
Yeah, I mean, it's going to be individual depending on like what is their physical activity at the moment. So if they're not doing anything because of these concerns about social judgment, then it might be about finding a safe space that they can get up their stamina a little bit and just get familiar with the movement, whether that's doing like yoga at home or running when it's quiet or whatever it might be, so that they can start just getting comfortable with the process of getting out of breath and feeling the way your body feels when you're exercising, which can actually feel very uncomfortable for a lot of people. And so, yeah, to get familiar with that on your own can be a really helpful way to then feel like, okay, I can tolerate that. It wasn't as bad as I thought it was going to be. And from there, is there an iteration of this that I would be prepared to do in public? And so then, say somebody then is running on their own, maybe they can then find a partner that's going to be supportive with them, or they could go to the gym and just go on the treadmill. Maybe they can go at a quieter time and then build up to when it's busier. And what you're doing is you're gradually exposing yourself to different ways of being in that feared kind of situation. And as you get that data, your brain starts to recalibrate. Okay, no judgment coming in here. Nobody seems to be looking at me. Maybe I can try the other stuff. So that kind of graded exposure is one way around. But I think also, in terms of social evaluation, sometimes it can be just really helpful to find a way to seek some kind of social support and some social in. So group classes are really good for that, because particularly if they say, classes are suitable for beginners, because everybody's doing the same kind of exercise. If it's mixed ability, you're not going to feel on the spot, check out those kind of things. So you're not completely doing yourself a disservice by going to an athlete's class. But that can then make you feel part of something and reduce those feelings, and feel supported as well if you make connections in those classes and you've got a trainer. But also, if you have the ability, having a personal trainer or having, an introduction from the gym that you're in or whatever, those things can really break down some kind of stigmas and barriers around, oh, I don't know how to use the machines, or everyone's kind of hostile and judgmental. If you make some of those connections, that can, again, allay some of those fears.
Yeah, so it's kind of like strength in numbers is true, yeah, especially in a social setting. Yeah. And is it important to focus on why someone has, like, we'll say, a block around, exercise, like what's holding them back? Or is it more important to just focus on the behavior itself that they want to change? Or would you focus on both? What would be kind of like an important focus there?
Yeah, I mean, I'm always interested in the why, because I think that leads to sustaining behavior change. So I think there are things that we can do to change behavior without really questioning that. But generally, what I would say is combine both of those in parallel at some point. But you might start with the behavior change and then come to try and understand why a bit more, or you might start with the why and then bring in behavior change. It depends on the presentation. But if people are really have high concerns about it, then it is worthwhile unpacking what are the main blocks. And for some people, it might be, things about social judgment, and trying to understand why that's so scary to them. Have they had really negative experiences of that, which have really sat with them and transcend, kind of rational reason in the moment of how likely that's going to be? Or it could be things like I mentioned about the tolerance of bodily sensations. For some people, that heart rate elevating and feeling all sweaty and hot just feels really unpleasant and horrible, and it doesn't feel at all like it's healthy. And particularly people with anxiety disorders, an increased heart rate can really, really signal that things aren't good and get into a bit of a panic. So if it's those kind of visceral sensations that are a block, then that's useful data to know, because we need to target that.
Yeah. So is it fair to say that an element of mindfulness the whole way through as a changing behavior is like kind of essential to see what actually is going on, the reality of the situation? Is that something that you work on as well?
Yeah, I mean, mindfulness is a term that gets used a lot. And I guess when I think about mindfulness and when I think about where it's come from the mindfulness-based stress reduction courses developed by Jon Kabat-Zinn, right? And the premise of mindfulness there is that partly it's the attentional awareness. So noticing where our attention is, what we're paying attention to, what thought processes are going on. But there's two other parts of that as well, which is the position of non-judgment. And so whatever arises is what arises. We're not kind of negatively narrating or positively narrating. We're just kind of seeing and being with, which is that metacognitive attitude and position is not one that we're generally familiar with. And then the other element to it as well is compassion. So being permissive of our own experience. So often people think they're being mindful because they're like, I'm having this negative thought, this negative thought, this negative thought. But when they're having these negative thoughts, they're also telling themselves off for it. Oh my gosh, that's pathetic. Why am I thinking that? That's really not going to happen. So they're just getting into a spiral of becoming more aware of thoughts, but they're not really being mindful because there's no observer perspective. They're just kind of getting back into it and adding more to it. And there's no compassion. So I think those two parts of mindfulness are so key. So to answer your question, then yes, I think mindfulness is a real good thread throughout every bit of behavior change.
Yeah. So what exactly could someone notice? Let's say they're mindless before they work with you. Hopefully not. And then they work with you and they become more mindful and more compassionate. And maybe just explain like self-compassion a little bit as well. What difference could they notice in terms of an experience, let's just say on the gym floor, for example, before and after?
Yeah, it's a good question. So I suppose just to explain self-compassion, again, another term that often gets conflated with self-indulgence. So people think, oh, if I'm being self-compassionate, then I'm not going to be disciplined at all and I'm not going to improve myself. But we can, again, subdivide self-compassion or compassion into 4 elements. And one of them is this, the sense of kindness, being warm towards yourself. But one of them is also around identifying that we're suffering in some way, that acknowledgement, And then the next part of that is being aware that that's a shared human experience. So that's not a sign of failure. It's not a sign of being weak or lesser. It's part of the human experience. And then the crucial part, which kind of negates this idea that it's self-indulgent, is the commitment and intention to want to change or improve or alleviate that suffering. So if you're somebody that's, you know, really unfit and is reliant on comfort eating, that's not good for your overall health, and it's not good for your overall kind of mental well-being either. And if we were saying that's the self-indulgent route would be whenever you're feeling crap, eat the food that you want to eat. That's whether we call it self-indulgent, but that's not self-compassion, and it's not helpful. What the self-compassionate thing would be to acknowledge that you are suffering, that you do feel crap, that things are difficult, softening towards yourself and asking yourself, what do you need in that moment? And the question of whether you need to eat or whether something else is going to better serve you, you know, gives you your direction. It's not to eat. That's not actually going to help anything. It probably is going to make things worse in the long term, or just even the immediate term after you've eaten, because you probably feel feelings of guilt. So then it points you in a better direction. So when I talk about self-compassion, it is really that kind of pragmatic idea of what self-compassion is, being permissive and warm towards yourself, but also pragmatic in what changes you need to make to actually better your experience and alleviate your suffering. So to go back to your question, the changes that someone might see on the gym floor if they've been anxious about going before and they were kind of not wanting to do exercise in front of people, I guess the reduction of that anxiety, we would imagine one would see through doing different bits of kind of experimenting and paying attention to particular thoughts and exploring how valid that was, and being aware of all of the kind of data that we're getting back from those things. And then when you're on the gym floor, it might not be that you don't have any thoughts about evaluation of others. You might notice someone look over and immediately get that pang of anxiety. But in the kind of mindful approach to that, you notice how you physically feel. You realize that it's triggered by this look. You notice all the kind of thoughts of, oh my God, did they look at me in a negative way? Are they thinking that I'm doing this wrong? And you're kind of a bit separated from those thoughts and able to decenter rather than kind of close in on yourself and try and think your way out of that. Like, oh my gosh, am I doing it wrong? What do I need to correct? Blah, 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 blah. Instead, you just come back to your physical movement and getting back into the exercise and finding comfort in your body. And then we've seen the anxiety reduce. And also, I guess, from the compassionate element, so what if that person has made some kind of judgment? Does that actually determine my worth? Or is this just a good thing that I'm here doing this exercise, which is good for my body?
Yeah, very good. So would you see that self-compassion is lacking in society nowadays, or have you seen examples of it, with clients? What would be your kind of opinion on how kind of widespread self-compassion is in society?
Yeah, I think the opposite of self-compassion is self-criticism. And I don't know if it's increased self-criticism, but I would say that the vast majority of us are very self-critical. And I think, a lot of things in our society set us up to be self-critical. And like I say, we're not familiar with self-compassion. We don't know that we can be kind to ourselves and improve ourselves. We just think to improve, we have to be our own biggest critic. And that's, reflected back to us in lots of different things, from the glorification of, music schools and sports people that had really tough coaches that didn't let them off until they got it right, and all of this kind of stuff. That can be effective to a degree, but it also has massive negative downsides. And in order to really kind of find a balance where we're improving ourselves, but we're not kind of finding dissatisfaction with where we are at the moment as well, we need to be self-compassionate. But generally, I would say society is very, very self-critical. And I see that in everybody that I work with, colleagues, patients, and otherwise.
Yeah. So then what are kind of ways to avoid self-criticism if it's in society already, if people are already, like most people you see, colleagues, even, you know, experts are already self-critical? How can you like avoid it? Do you have any kind of, you know, go-to strategies for avoiding self-criticism?
Number one thing is to become aware that you are. And lots of times, even myself, like my own experience was I was thinking, oh, I'm actually very self-compassionate. I'm not that hard on myself. And I think some people can be lulled into that sense that they're not critical because they don't have this real explicit critic that's going, that was wrong, that was really bad, oh my God, you need to do better. But other self-critics can be slightly sneakier. Like mine is a bit more like, are you sure you want to do that? Because that might be upsetting for such and such. And, you know, you didn't really think about that. So it's kind of positioned itself as a way of helping me, but actually at the expense of my own ability to relax. And the kind of, I guess, what is it? The ultimatum being, if you don't address that, then that's going to be quite bad. So I think that the number one, to answer your question, the number one thing that we need to do is become aware of what our critic presents as and look out for it. And part of that is mindfulness, is kind of noticing our thoughts, noticing our motivation for things, noticing how we feel. And that can be an easier way to get back to our thoughts. So, oh, I feel kind of off in this situation, whatever that emotion is, anxious, guilty, sad. What are the thoughts that are going on right now? And usually even just kind of writing it out, like pen to paper, we become aware of loads of different critical thoughts in some shape or form. And below the negative automatic thoughts that are a bit more surface level is probably some sort of unrelenting high standard that we've got. I should always be achieving. To not achieve is to fail. To put other people before myself is honorable, and to not is selfish. So as we collect a bit of data on our negative automatic thoughts, we probably identify some underlying themes of these quite, severe, rigid beliefs, which are only going to make us critical. So I think that the first thing that's really important is to pay attention to our thought processes, and then look for common themes and explore that a little bit.
Brilliant. Yeah. So I feel like you're talking a little bit about acceptance. So let's say somebody, they're self-critical, or they don't even know what self-compassion is, or they have, some kind of challenge like, IBS, for example, something like that. Let's say they don't accept it. Like, what's the issue there? Why does somebody even need to accept something? Why can't they just kind of like, try harder, be more motivated, and improve that way?
Yeah. It's a good question. And one of the best ways that I've got of depicting this is if you imagine kind of making a clenched fist. So that's something that you can't change, whether it's your IBS, whether it's not being able to press 25 kilograms or whatever it would be. That's the thing that you really want to change and get past. And for some things, right, it's possible. We can build up beyond 25 kilograms. For some things, it's not possible. But even in the things that it is possible, we've got huge resistance in the moment to it being the way it is. And that being so, that generates a lot of tension. So we've got the fist, which is the thing that we don't want. And then as we're not accepting, so we're resisting, we're pushing against that with our other hand, we can imagine, which builds more tension, just even to take that physical enactment. So the tension then goes from the fist all the way down to the forearm, to the elbow, and on the other side, the part that's generating the resistance. So you're kind of in this standoff between two parts of you. This is what the way it is, and this is the way I want it to be. And, more tension ensues. And with that tension comes mental battles, comes physical tension, comes a difficulty in focusing, because we're just stuck on this one thing that we want to be different. So often we can generate change to the thing that we don't want to accept by leaning into it a little bit more. But I think the word acceptance is often conflated with resignation. I'm resigned to this. But actually what we mean is bear with it. And then let's kind of move with it a little bit and see how we can change via changing how we're relating to it.
Yeah, go with it. I love that idea instead of trying to fight against it. I imagine somebody, driving down the street and there's like a roadblock and they're like, no, I'm getting through this roadblock. Yeah. And if they just maybe backed up and went down a different street, sure, it takes a little bit longer, but they're getting to where they want to go as opposed to building up all that tension. So you just kind of mentioned data a little bit. So, and like we're talking a bit about awareness and being aware of, challenges, with your health. So like, how can someone, I guess, kind of collect data? Like, would journaling be one way to do it? Or is it like working with a psychologist such as yourself?
Yeah, I mean, I always talk about collecting data because in the initial stages of therapy, I've got a model of therapy that, I think works based on my training, based on my research, based on lots of times anecdotal experience and personal experience. But as a patient's coming into therapy, they want to see how this all relates to them. So we generate a hypothesis based on all of this research and training. But in order for us to work out how valid that is and that we're going down the right street and to have that buy-in, it's important that we generate some hypotheses and then we get some data to kind of corroborate. So an example would be, from my knowledge, in irritable bowel syndrome, one of the things that maintains bowel dysregulation is skipping meals, avoiding particular foods, leaving long time between eating, sitting on the toilet for a long period of time, trying to strain, et cetera, et cetera. So one of the first things that we do is we get out a symptom monitoring diary where we can rate symptom severity, stress, number of times went to the toilet, how long spent straining, how many meals missed, what time they were eating. So some of these key parameters. When we get it back, we say, oh yeah, your symptoms did seem to flare up, for example, on the Thursday, Friday, Saturday, after you'd spent 3 days being really stressed and you'd avoided meals in the latter half of the day on the 2 days prior. So we can start making those links. So in therapy, it's set up that way. We generate hypotheses and then we create a symptom monitoring diary or a monitoring diary of some sort. And then we use that to inform what we're going to tweak and change. So people can make their own, right? If they've identified, okay, this is my issue, and this is what I think is going on here. So what data points do I need? You can generate your own. But what I will say is it's best to get support from a professional with that, because we can also get really fixated if we've generated particular hypotheses. So in IBS, a big thing is these particular foods are bad for me, I should never eat them. And then because we're paying so much attention and we're hyper-focused, we just get that data back and it's not quite right. We're not looking at other factors which are important to take into account as well.
Yeah, I can imagine you think you found a solution to your challenge, but somebody with your expertise would be able to say, let's look big picture and see what else is going on here. Yeah. What was your kind of personal experience with like psychology, mental health, and what led you to the level of expertise that you have now?
So my experience, I did a psychology undergrad. I really enjoyed it. I did a health psychology module, and that was the one that I enjoyed most. And I was really fascinated in that mind-body connection. The lecturer presented all sorts of research on psychoneuroimmunology and some seminal studies around how stressed carers were compared to non-stressed carers, and they were each given these punch biopsies. And they found that the stressed carer group, their wound took on average, I think it was 9 days longer to heal than the non-stressed group, which kind of spoke to the fact that, our immune system is physiologically impaired by stress. And then from there, they looked into precise mechanisms. So found that all very fascinating. And then I was told how competitive psychology was to get into, and I'd gotten a part-time marketing job. So I thought I would give that a go full-time when I finished and work out what I wanted to do. But whilst I was doing that job, I got quite ill. And I think, again, just bringing in my models of working with people, looking at the biopsychosocial aspect of it, I was prone to get urinary tract infections, and that's what I started getting anyway. So that's the kind of physiological sensitivity or predilection that my body has. But then I socially didn't have my networks anymore. They'd all moved out of the city, and I was much more kind of alone, and I wasn't enjoying my job, and there was a lot of pressure, and it wasn't very reinforcing. And then, psychologically, as I started getting these symptoms, I was worrying about, what does this mean? And are they ever going to go? What's going to happen now? They keep evolving. I don't have any answers. So the three experiences kind of merged together, which meant that these symptoms kept going for a long time. And it was through my dad, who was doing a master's in mindfulness, suggesting that I did mindfulness, which initially I was resistant to, but I decided to give a go with some more convincing by his partner, who's a bit more skilled in explaining why that might be helpful, because she's a clinical psychologist. I started doing mindfulness, and I found that actually that did change how I was feeling towards my symptoms, and perhaps gave me a bit more reprieve than I had previously. As I started seeing those benefits, I decided I'm going to go back and study health psychology as a master's, which I then went on to do. And whilst I was doing that, I got involved in research projects around mindfulness for multiple sclerosis. And we saw that that had a huge impact on people's psychological well-being. And these people had, really hard trajectories to get their heads around, but just 8 weeks of mindfulness delivered via Skype made a huge difference to them. And then from there, I did a PhD looking at CBT for IBS. And then I did a postdoc looking at developing a CBT-based intervention for people with inflammatory bowel disease, And then I realized that you mentioned before, the broad kind of areas of mental health as well. I was very specialized in looking at the psychological interactions between particular psychological experiences and health, but I had no real knowledge of wider mental health conditions. And, there's so much comorbidity between mental health conditions and health conditions. So I then did a postgraduate diploma in CBT, which placed me in an NHS service, working predominantly with people with anxiety disorders and depression. And I worked there for 3 years and became a senior therapist there. And then just recently, I've left to establish a specialist health psychology practice. So that's my broad journey.
Wow, that's like so much experience. And one question I was going to ask that you sort of answered, but I still wanted to talk about is how important is social support? So you spoke about your dad and doing a master's in mindfulness, which sounds amazing. So I love the idea of going back to college. It's kind of like never too late to go back to college once you realize what you want to do. Yeah, because I went back, I feel like I was 26. So when I went to college first, when I was 18, I was like a headless chicken. Like I was like sort of, caught up in like, society being like, you have to go to college, which was fine. I think I'm better for it, but didn't really benefit me as much as when I went back when I was older, and I was like a man on a mission. I was like, I'm here to learn, about this area, and it's going to lead me to here. It was like a totally different experience. So I guess 2 questions: social support, is it important? And then just your thoughts around going back to college, if you did go back to college when you're a bit older.
Yeah. Social support, it's fundamental. And there's different types of social support. So there's the kind of emotional social support, which, different people need to different degrees, but we all need some basic emotional support to tell us that we're safe. And then there's the kind of practical social support in terms of, somebody there to if you're ill and you can't really make healthy meals, someone there to make you healthy meals is going to make a huge amount of difference. And then there's the kind of informational social support. So people that you can trust for information, whether that's doctors, whether that's you're a friendly pharmacist or a physiotherapist. Those 3 different types are really important. But on the more, I guess just the social connection element, which transcends social support as a construct, I think. In fact, one of my PhD proposals was around the role of social connection in mindfulness. How important is that in order for us to see the benefits of mindfulness? Because mindfulness is usually, in traditional forms practiced in a group, and we learn from each other's experiences, and we feel a sense of kind of closeness to the people that we practice with. And that really makes us feel part of something, which is kind of almost an unquantifiable feeling, but it just has such an effect. And you see that with people that go through different illnesses and things like that. When you connect on a shared human connection level, it just makes a huge difference. And there's fascinating research. I think David Hamilton talks about this in some of his books. And there's another researcher that I always forget his name, but around the physiological health benefits that come with social connection, social support, on those physiological measures, reduce cortisol, and other kind of markers of central nervous system functioning, autonomic nervous system functioning, all improved when there is more social support. And another fascinating study around, there was this little kind of village, I think it was in the US, or this might have been Italy, I always forget precise details. Anyway, there was a cluster of different villages, and all of them were similar in terms of where they were in proximity to the main city, what the environment was like, what kind of food they ate, etc., etc. But this one village was different in that the sense of community that was there, it wasn't a commuter town. It was, generations of people stayed there, and there was a real sense of community. People know each other. And so the older people, there was an increase in longevity of people living in that particular village or town, as opposed to all of the rest of them. And they controlled for all sorts of other markers, diet, metabolic rate, etc., etc. This social support element, social connection element was protective beyond everything else. So it just shows how fundamental that is.
Yeah, I think that study was in the USA. I feel like I've heard about that. Yeah.
I think there's been a few actually, but yeah, I think you're right. The one that I'm thinking of, I think it was in the USA.
Yeah. So I kind of feel as though society, or in the Western world, it's very like individualistic, independence and being like the number one, being the CEO. It's like, oh, that's the best thing. Like Elon Musk, Michael Jordan, Tiger Woods, LeBron. These are all like, the pinnacles of like society, the coolest people in society, whatever. Like that's success. And also, it's almost like being busy is sort of valued also as well. Mm-hmm. So like individualism and just always being busy. Oh, if you're busy, you must be productive, and that's great. Then, like, of course, you're a good person then if you're busy all the time. Is there any side effects to that, or what are your thoughts around that? And maybe like, what would you propose instead that people could value instead of those sort of values for mental health?
Yeah. I mean, I think that's one of the chronic problems in our society, because there is this over value on productivity and achievement. And that's coming from somebody that does value those things. I do, but there has to be a balance with other things that are important to you. If that's the primary thing that takes all of your attention and all of your focus, and everything else could, fly by the wayside, then there's going to be a kickback at some point. Maybe not now, but once you get to that goal, likely that happens. In fact, we see that with celebs as well. They get to the top of their game and then they just turn to addiction, or they, have some kind of mental health crisis because, and lots of successful business people have talked about this. It's kind of like a reserve that will never be filled. You get there and then you kind of want the next thing, but you're chasing this high that can never be satiated. So it really is problematic in terms of you being able to live a life full of contentment. So there's no reason why you can't do that and achieve, but we need to check out what the other things that are important to you. And there's no right or wrong here. But generally, when I work with my clients, we look at different areas of life. So relationships, that can be romantic, it can be just broadly like relationships, friendships, family. And then, spirituality, for some people that's religion, but for some people that's, having a connection with nature, private leisure, what's meaningful to you. And for some people that would be, well, I really love to exercise or dive or, do outdoorsy things. And for other people that's more, I really like, reading and getting lost in characters and being creative. So there's no right or wrong. And I think it's just about using those different areas to identify for you what's important. And you'll be amazed to find how difficult people find that, because we never really ask ourselves that question. We're funneled into the school system and then perhaps university or some kind of work hierarchical structure, and that's our tunnel vision, because the idea is we make enough money so we've got enough safety and freedom to do stuff like holidays or buy more stuff. But once we get there, we find that again, it's like not being able to fill that hole. So the earlier you can ask yourself that question and give yourself permission to explore, maybe you don't know right away, but just test things out, the better.
Yeah, I feel like you're talking a lot about people's values. So how would knowing your values versus not knowing them, how would that like tie into your health? Let's say someone is just like, oh yeah, health, being healthy is good, and I know it's important, but maybe it's not for me. Would you do value work with clients, and why should somebody consider their values?
Yeah. So in order to try and get them to look after their health, do you mean?
Yeah, let's say they're like, my health isn't great, but that's fine. It could be better. And let's just say they've been diagnosed with a condition, like high blood pressure, or, maybe type 2 diabetes, for example.
So I guess, yeah, I mean, it depends on what they're coming to me for. If they're coming because they've got low moods, or they're anxious, or they do think that they need to get better control over their health, then we'd be looking at this probably for different reasons, but the values that we're exploring would be the same. So I suppose one thing that we want to know is, how are they spending their time currently? And is that in line with what's important to them? So if they're sat there reading the news all of the time and kind of getting angry on Twitter, is that a life that's meaningful to them? And what would they like to be doing instead? What's important to them from there? And how can that be balanced out over different kind of constructs? And is their health getting in the way currently? Or will not looking after their health get in the way of them being able to live in line with these values? So it can be like a motivating way to say, let's take it a bit seriously, but let's try and incorporate things that you can do to look after your health in a way that's in line with your values. So if somebody really likes being outdoorsy, then it's not that we need to get you down to the gym to get your blood pressure under control. It's that we, go out hiking on the weekend with friends or whatever it might be. So there's lots of different ways that just tapping into values can inform how to navigate things that are currently difficult for you in a way that's going to better your health and well-being.
Yeah. So kind of tied into health, you had a post called Nociception and Pain. And that kind of ties into mindfulness as well. I think, if you're mindful, you'll be aware if you're in pain or not. And then the nociception is kind of just something I'm not too familiar with. So could you just talk about pain and nociception, and if mindfulness ties into that as well?
Yeah, absolutely. So nociception is the part of the pain equation that we think completely determines pain generally as a society. So we're not, again, taught why we experience pain. We assume that there's some kind of structural damage or kind of noxious stimuli that sends chemical signals to the brain to say, this is going wrong, generate some pain now, please. The idea being, obviously, that that's kind of evolutionarily beneficial for our survival. If we know that we've been cut, then we can address that. Or if we know that we're kind of getting some kind of irritation, we're not going to be poisoned. But that chemical signaling that happens, that's only one part of the equation, and that's the nociception part, right? Some kind of some stimuli stimulates the nerves in that particular area, and that sends off nociception to the brain, and that kind of will inform the brain that there's something gone on there, and that can generate a pain sensation. But there's another key part of whether the pain sensation is generated or not, and that is the kind of psychosocial context. So our appraisal is really important of that as well. Our emotions are really important. If we're anxious, then we're more likely to feel the pain, or more likely to feel the pain stronger or for longer, because our body's in a state of hypervigilance. So we've got more kind of reactivity in our nervous system. Similarly, that comes the interaction with trauma, early trauma, or trauma throughout the lifetime, that can have an impact on how our central nervous system is functioning. We're more likely to be hypervigilant and highly reactive to experiences in our environment, and particularly pain. So we might then get more sensation of pain. So if we think about nociception plus the psychosocial experience, the nociception is kind of part of the relay, and then the degree to which pain sensation is turned up or down is dependent on these other factors. So we can, in some situations, get nociception and no pain. So there's a famous talk that I forget what his name is. His second name's Lorimer, but he that's going to really annoy me. But anyway, he's a big pain researcher, and he talks about how he's Australian. So he was walking in the bush, and he experienced like a scratch on his leg, and he didn't think anything about it. And so he just carried on, walking. And then that scratch was akin to like a twig scratching him, which he'd felt many times before. Off he goes, and then he collapses because he's been bitten by some kind of venomous snake. Anyway, he gets the antidote. He's, nothing bad happens, fortunately. And that's all fine. And then he goes walking in the bush sometime later, not on the same day, but months after. And he experiences a scratch on his leg. And all of a sudden, he starts sweating. He feels his heart palpitating. He gets this real pain coming from his leg. And that's because his nervous system is snake bite, snake bite, snake bite. But this time it was just a twig. So our whole kind of system learns how to respond, how to turn up that amplification on pain based on our experiences, and to what degree it's likely to be a threat. Things that are likely to cause it a threat, obviously, are things that have put us in danger before, but it can also be other things that make us feel unsafe. So that just generalizes out anyway. And also the threat of the fact that this might go on forever. So, people with chronic illness or pain that is painful in its own right comes up for whatever reason, a mix of factors usually. If they're then confronted by this pain again and again, they start to have this threatening thought, what if this never goes away? And then that's, amplifies that threat. So it keeps this pain cycle going.
Wow, yeah, that's fascinating. So is that an example of PTSD that guy had in Australia?
Not PTSD, but, that's part of the way that PTSD functions. It's just that our kind of nervous system has this short circuit. Why can't I say that word? It's quickly learned a short pathway of, oh my gosh, we need to amplify this much quicker than it otherwise would do. Yeah.
So it's like we become hypersensitive to something that's happened before. It's like we learned to be sensitive to something, but maybe that's not the most effective way to be, because it's almost like, would you say, we kind of mindlessly sometimes form these approaches to thinking?
It's completely subconscious. So it might, I don't think he even said in his example, it was that he thought it was a snake bite. It's that his body automatically reacted as though it was. So if we think about that, this is where, we were talking about mindfulness before. Turning towards our cognitive experience is going to be super important, because we can identify more readily some of these thoughts that are buried beneath the surface.
Errors with your thinking, maybe kind of learned. It's funny, you think of habits and you think of physical habits, I walk to work this way, or I on my weekends I go and exercise here. But mentally, we can also have kind of habits or thought loops even. So what are some of the common thinking habits, and maybe some of the ineffective ones, and ways to form more effective thinking habits that benefit our health as opposed to taking away from our health? Yeah,
I think the way that our brain is wired up is to make shortcuts so that we don't have to use as much brain power. So these thinking habits can be helpful to us, but they can easily become the default. And often when we're in negative emotional states, or in a particular pattern of thinking about particular things, they end up becoming unhelpful and kind of self-fulfilling. So there's a whole range of different thinking habits that come up. One common one, which I think is blighting us all a lot at the moment, particularly on social media, is this black and white type of thinking, also known as all or nothing. So we completely lose the nuance, and we think that something is either one way or the other, and we can't see that there's a whole grey area in the middle. And that really kind of does us a disservice, because if you think about in anxiety, people think it's either going to go terribly or it'll be completely fine. And so that's a much more scary prospect than thinking it could just be all right, you know. So that's a key one. And again, we can see how it's useful to us because we just kind of categorize, but it ends up doing us a disservice. Another big one is catastrophizing. So we use what information we've got and a sense of fear or uncertainty about how it might go negatively, and that quickly snowballs into the worst case scenario, again designed to be effective. If we can look at the negative outcomes, we can protect ourselves against it. That's the line of thinking. And so people often buy into this being helpful for them, overlooking, of course, the fact that if we're catastrophizing a lot and thinking of the worst case scenario all the time, our mental landscape is just threat. What could go wrong? So again, it's kind of trying to reel it back in and understanding that in ambiguity, it doesn't mean that we always have to be on the lookout for the worst and the bad things that can happen, because there's a whole range of the spectrum that we cut out when we think that way, that again, neutral or positive. So I think those are some of the really key ones. The other one that we touched on before is around, self-critical thinking, the fact that we're just so hard on ourselves. And again, designed to be protective and make us effective. If I can identify what I'm not doing well now, then I can improve. But there is another way of doing that.
Yeah, that reminds me, the catastrophizing with my working out. And when I'm tired, I'll tell myself, oh, this workout is going to be, it's a bad idea. I'm going to get injured. It's too much. I can't do it. But I know, like, my own level of fitness. I know that if I'm feeling tired, I can do a little bit less. There's loads of ways it can go. It's not just like black and white, And the key thing I try to remind myself of is that the workouts where I feel like doing them the least, just by getting it done, they're the most rewarding. So, yeah, I think, that's kind of like a strength of mine. But obviously, different people have different strengths and weaknesses. But I think, kind of going back to what you said earlier about like awareness, I think that was only possible through like repetition and becoming aware. So I'm just kind of fortunate that I became aware of that. So just another post you had was about things to remember when making changes. So I think people think like, okay, I'm motivated to, exercise more or eat better, or manage my mental health better. And it's just a case of doing it. And it's just going to be like kind of one-to-one. It's just going to be like, I make a decision and the change is going to happen, or it's going to be kind of seamless. So what are some things to keep in mind when making a health change specifically?
Yeah, I mean, you touched on it there, the fact that motivation can wax and wane. So when we decide to make that change, our motivation's higher just by virtue of coming to that decision. I'm going to do it. But actually, we need the tools and mechanisms to support us when the motivation goes. I think that's one really important thing to navigate, not just to coast on the idea that we're going to stay motivated. And also, with that, thinking about that, the thinking habit of all or nothing thinking, we can tend to throw ourselves in the deep end, right? I'm going to go from no exercise to, walking every single day for at least half an hour. And that inevitably is going to lead to like a boom bust pattern. We do it for a while, we think we're killing it, and then we're like, oh my God, I'm exhausted. And actually I've taken up a load of my time that I didn't have, and I can't do that now. And then it's really hard to get up that motivation again. So we make things much harder for ourselves when we try and kind of plow in. And I suppose in line with that all or nothing thinking, if we have set out some kind of plan for ourselves of how we're going to do it 3 times a week, and it's reasonable and it's feasible, and it's, even just, 30 minutes, but we only go twice instead of 3 times, we automatically see that as having failed rather than having achieved. And so that is not a rewarding thing. Whereas if we had that outlook that, oh, I worked out twice, whereas last week I worked out 0, that's a win. So it's that mindset of how we relate to what we're doing. And I think we often forget to reinforce ourselves for what we've done. And we're always looking for how we could have improved, or did we meet a particular goal that we set? And if we're too much down that path, it all becomes very reinforcing. And then we end up building up these negative associations with the experience. And then we just don't want to do it. So how we feel is important.
Yeah. So yeah, reinforce yourself in the right way. That's where self-compassion comes in, really. Yeah, that's brilliant. Yeah. A lot of useful things to keep in mind. I definitely see a lot of people jumping into the deep end straight away far too often, when they kind of forget that maybe it's their first trying to change, or that approach hasn't worked in the past. But you spoke just a little bit about in your research, I think you did like an 8-week mindfulness course. Could you talk a bit just about the research on mindfulness, and then the research you've done on mindfulness as well?
Yeah. So I mean, so much research on just the physiological benefits of mindfulness. It's associated with reduced markers of stress, whether that's cortisol, improved blood pressure, heart rate variability, all of the rest of the kind of things. And in some chronic illness conditions, it's also associated with a reducing symptom severity, including in irritable bowel syndrome. And in really challenging long-term health conditions like multiple sclerosis, it's associated with improved self-compassion, reduced distress, improved acceptance of something that's really difficult to accept. So there's lots of different benefits from the literature of mindfulness. And then my research in particular, that was when I was doing my master's, I was involved in this more kind of feasibility trial looking at 8-week distance Skype delivered mindfulness and mindfulness-based cognitive therapy course tailored for people with multiple sclerosis, but progressive multiple sclerosis. So there was quite a lot of disability as opposed to when people have kind of primary progressive MS. This was secondary progressive MS, or when they have relapsing remitting MS, they could be predominantly kind of able-bodied and not have very many symptoms, and they might have a while off before it degenerates. But secondary progressive MS, they've kind of been told your symptoms have now gotten worse and they're only going to keep getting worse, which is a horrible thing, imagine, to hear, because the symptoms can be anything. It attacks any part of the nervous system. So this research was so interesting because this was before pandemic, so before we were all tech savvy with Zoom and whatnot, and Skype was the most clunky thing. Sorry, Skype, but it was not great. But it still managed to get the desired effect where people engaged with it, people practiced their mindfulness practice, people had an important shared experience together, and from that their scores of psychological distress around their MS significantly reduced. And that was just in a real small trial. And then I think there was subsequent studies as well, which kind of reflected those results too. So, I mean, it's something that I come back to when I think about the power of mindfulness. And I'm working with clients for whom their symptoms could actually get better with using a lot of these techniques that we've talked about. And so there's lots of hope in that. And there's, this intrinsic motivation to kind of keep plowing on to do it, to get to that end result, which also can be a bit of a barrier to doing mindfulness because we're aiming for something, and mindfulness is about being with what is. But with these people with MS, it wasn't about trying to achieve, and it was about kind of making peace with something that's really difficult to make peace with, and that they were able to do that, and that substantially changed their experience was, I don't know, really inspiring. And it really shows how it can improve resilience, and how humans, by changing the way they relate to their experience, can have a completely different experience.
Yeah, definitely. I feel as though a lot of the challenges people face in society today, mindfulness is like almost the perfect kind of treatment for it. I won't say solution, because like, you know, you can't, everybody suffers, you know, it doesn't matter who you are. So you can't like get rid of suffering completely, but kind of just like you said, like the relationship to the suffering can improve a lot. Yeah. So correct me if I'm wrong, but I think something that could help with like your mindfulness, or just, you know, maybe challenges in your life is CBT as well. Is that what you did a lot of your research on? And could you just explain CBT? Because I feel as though I hear it a lot, but I'm not 100% certain on what it is. And I'm sure a lot of the listeners aren't either.
Yeah, so CBT, it stands for cognitive behavioral therapy. So it's a type of evidence-based psychotherapy. So it's different to traditional psychotherapy, as we might know psychotherapy from the movies, where, you know, there's quite a stoic therapist that doesn't really smile or talk much and just asks a lot of questions. CBT is very kind of pragmatic and action-oriented therapy. And the premise of the therapy is that in our experience, we can deconstruct it into what happens, and then from there, our thoughts about it, our feelings about it, our responses to it, and our physical sensations. And it's an interaction between all of these things that keep our presentation going. So that is applicable to different anxiety disorders, to different chronic illnesses, even to depression. We have these cycles, and because we're experiencing, say, emotional distress, we have all sorts of thoughts about how we need to get out of that. And from there, we have behaviors dictated by those thoughts, and we have our physical experience of that. And so all of these things are really intuitive. You know, I don't want to have this thought, so I need to push it away. I shouldn't be in company when I'm like this, so I need to withdraw. But then we start to see in CBT how some of the behaviors might not be helpful to us, and they might be keeping that cycle going. So we target the behaviors first generally and see how that changes some of the thoughts and the feelings and the physical sensations. And when we start getting a bit of traction there, then we move into the harder to tackle thoughts. Some of them might have already changed by changing our behaviors, and some of them might be more ingrained. So then there's a bit more exploration about that, where the thoughts have come from, how valid they are, if we bring in different information, if we put it to other people. So there's lots of different ways that we can explore that. And I guess a big criticism that people have of CBT is that it says the predominant way to change our emotional experience is via our thoughts and behaviors, and not directly. And I think a lot of the research moving forward in the last even kind of 10, 15 years is that actually we have a direct line to our emotions as well through our physical kind of what we do physically, and paying attention to our physical sensations. But also there's different kind of emotion regulation things that we can do, you know, self-soothing. But I mean, at some point, I think it starts to get a bit pedantic, because in my practice, I use CBT as a central framework, and we could just conceptualize emotion regulation as a type of behavior that feeds into our emotional experience. Or whatever. I don't think it matters too much. The other criticism of CBT, I think, is it was developed to be like a time limited therapy, so that people have capped off sessions, and therefore it was very attractive economically for health services. Okay, if, you know, people are given 12 sessions of CBT and they're better by the end of it, and they stop presenting to healthcare, and they stop needing all these medications, then that's cheap. So yeah, great, let's do it. And then these centres in the UK, improving access to psychological therapy, IAP centres, were developed in order to increase that access to CBT. And so we can get very good results in IAPT, but for the people where there's been long-standing issues or problems are slightly more complex, it's not just depression, or it's not just panic disorder, there's a mixture of all sorts of stuff and maybe a history of trauma, we need more sessions to properly work through things. So there are some limitations, at least to the way that it's practiced, but I don't think it needs to be to the model itself, which can be really, really helpful way of people understanding their own experience and breaking it down and making some changes. Yeah,
so there's no one size fits all. And a saying I heard recently, a guy, Rich Rowley, is a big podcast. He was like, I think he said, is it feelings follow action? Have you heard of that one before? And would you think there's any truth to that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's one of the key premises in CBT, that when a good example is when people feel depressed, they're like, I don't want to do that because I don't feel like it. So what's the point? But if you then coax them into being able to just try it out and see how they feel, even if that, going out for a walk or calling a friend, actually they start to feel, I don't feel as crap as I did before. I'm not saying that your depression goes away overnight by one little simple thing, but actually if your mood was like a 9 out of 10 on the depression scale, and then you call that friend and it's only a 7 out of 10, that's a good little decrease there, and we can build on that. So action is really important for influencing how we feel.
Yeah. I think like with depression or any mental health challenge, it's like your mind can kind of trick you into telling you that you're weaker than you actually are. And then your body can sort of prove that you're actually, the human spirit's incredibly strong. So yeah, it can kind of disprove that notion. So relating to disproven notions, social media. So I think it's like this sort of runaway train. It just keeps growing and growing. And it's like everyone's on social media. It's like we're part of a live experiment that nobody signed up to, that everyone's involved in. And it's like I kind of don't know what to make of it, but I try and avoid it now, to be honest. But what are your thoughts on social media and the effects it has on mental health? And then also, is there any kind of ways that, as an expert, a psychological expert yourself, that you kind of consciously use social media so that you kind of, I guess, get the most out of it without having any side effects or minimizing the side effects?
Yeah. I mean, again, it's so individual for different people, and it can mean so many different things to different people. I suppose, and it's like you say, it's constantly evolving. So whereas it used to be Facebook, which did seem to foster a sense of kind of better connection with people for a while because you were seeing people that you hadn't seen for ages, then it kind of evolved into this sense of obligation. If you did something, you had to upload the photos. If someone posted, you had to like it. And then I think people got a bit sick of that, and it kind of moved over maybe more to Instagram, where it was less about having to kind of share your inner thoughts, but you could just share pictures. And so that's one of the difficulties that we've got. Social media is constantly evolving, and our expectations and way that we operate evolve with it. And we have to work out how, bring intention to that. Do we want to play that role? Do we want to engage with it in the way that it's expected, or are we going to opt out? And actually, I deleted Facebook in 2012, I think, because I was just like, I don't feel more connected to people. In fact, I feel like I'm having lesser quality interactions because people think that they know what I did. And I'm also getting frustrated because I'm seeing a whole range of opinions that I don't really care about and that actually don't always align with what I think. So I'm just, in a state of frustration with people. Whereas if I saw that person on the street or in a bar or whatever, we'd probably have a nice conversation. But now their unsolicited kind of opinion has felt oppressive to me, and that's not their fault. That's just the nature of Facebook. So I deleted it, and I felt so much better for it. My quality of friendships kind of got better. It felt like and then I haven't had Facebook since, but I stopped. And then I had Instagram, but I just didn't really use it that much. A sporadic post. I wasn't really, I wasn't somebody that was on it every day. And then it was only 2 years ago that I started an Instagram account professionally, so not for like personal use. And that was more to disseminate this kind of health psychology research and practice stuff that I think is so important to kind of raise awareness and understanding of. And so initially it was just a nice little kind of hobby. And then I guess it kind of resonated with people. And then the following grew quite a lot to a point that I didn't really envisage. And then it, rather than becoming something that I just did if I wanted to, it was something that I felt like I had to feed. And I guess, from that came opportunities, came, different bits, from talking to interesting people to going on podcasts to consultancy work and all sorts of stuff. So that was nice. And it branched out different ways of spreading, the word around health psychology, the stuff that I was interested in. But it also meant that now there is a sense of obligation to keep on there for me. But that's not a personal one, it's a professional one. But it's still something that I have to keep an eye on, because the nature of the platforms is to keep you sucked in and to keep you kind of making sure you're feeding the beast. So in terms of how I use it, I mean, just recently I kind of checked in with a couple of things. One was, now there's this shift towards reels, and I resisted that for a while because I was like, I don't know how I'm going to say what I need to say in like 15 seconds flat or whatever. And so I kind of boycotted, and now they're really strongly pushing it. So you kind of have to use them. So I just experimented. I used this idea of rolling with the resistance and just seeing what happened. And I guess part of that was me agreeing with myself not to be so perfectionistic. It doesn't have to be like a crystal clear message, and it doesn't have to be the most aesthetic thing, but what's the key point that you're trying to get across? And so that helped to some degree. And then, but as I was experimenting, my own behavioral experiment was to do that a bit more frequently so that I couldn't be perfectionistic, and I couldn't kind of pay too much attention to how it was received. And then I realized from doing that, it meant that I was on the platform more. And so that was having an impact on kind of my focus. So then I had to clock in again and be like, right, I need to not be on the platform within particular hours, and just kind of create a bit of time where I'm saying I'm creating content, and outside of that, not be on it and kind of limit use. So you have to, as things, change with the social media scape, you change, and then you have to keep kind of bringing in that awareness of how you're doing things and whether that's best serving you and the way that you want to spend your time.
Yeah, it ties back into the mindfulness again. Be mindful of how you're interacting with the beast, essentially. Yeah. So it sounds like you definitely were, but also it comes with its own challenges, and it's almost like the goalposts are always moving, because there's like a trend, or for example, TikTok, there's loads of trends there. If you're not mindful, you can kind of get caught up in them. But Sula, thank you very much for your time. Is there anything that we didn't go over, or anything you want to mention at all? Maybe some of your work that's coming up, or posts, or anything like that at all?
No, not really. I think that's everything. If anybody does have IBS, I'm going to be running a group in May, all online via Zoom. But apart from that, no, that's great. It's been lovely chatting.
Brilliant, yeah. And it's ironic that I'm calling social media a beast, and that's how we connected. And your work, your work is really good on it. That's what kind of caught my eye is the quality of the posts you have. So keep up the good work, and thanks for your time.
Cheers.
Thank you for listening to episode 26 of the Progression Health Podcast. That was the first episode in a series on mental health and mindfulness. A lot more exciting guests and information to come. So subscribe, like, listen, all that kind of stuff. Tell people if you enjoyed this episode, or if you have any questions about mental health and mindfulness. My email is attached to the posts. So please get in contact. Or progressionhealthcoaching@gmail.com is my email. In other news then, I also have spaces available for one-to-one personal training here in downtown San Francisco, or I also have online coaching spots available. So if you're looking to improve your health and you want to really cut out all of the effort you've been putting in with little reward, if you want to kind of fast track your way to a healthier you, a stronger you, then get in contact now. And my email again is progressionhealthcoaching@gmail.com.